Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology, sneaking in another show here before I retire, since I'll be doing several shows in the coming in the coming days, both Saturday and also Sunday. So won't have an opportunity to do this. I also need to get some patron-only content out for y'all. So patrons, be on the lookout for that as well. I'll probably be doing several shows tomorrow. So look forward to those. Okay, well, I wanted to interact with a video that Timothy Flanders put out that somebody alerted me to earlier. I just watched it, and I have some thoughts and points that I want to make interacting with Timothy and his comments on the situation over schism, and also how to handle schism and things along those lines. It's maybe about 10 minutes worth of footage that I'm going to review. So not too long. Just going to cut to the chase and skip the other parts. I'm going to start with the 6-minute mark. I'm going to skip the part around the 4-minute mark. He talks about how he's really aggravated. I don't think he used the word aggravated, but he's really worked up. You can kind of tell he gets worked up towards the end about this situation, on how people are handling the situation today with sedevacantism, Beneplanism, or Benevacantism, and the SSPX. And it's not what you think. His frustration is with people who are saying that, hey, some of this is schismatic. That's where his frustration is. His frustration is not with the SSPX. It's not with Dr. Mazza or Benevacantists of one stripe or another. The frustration seems to be with those who are pointing out the problem with Benevacantism, SSPX, Sedevacantism. And he does have problems with Benevacantism, SSPX, Sedevacantism. He has issues with all of those. But it seems that his aggravation is more with those who are pointing out the problems rather than the people who are producing the problems. And so that's what I want to interact with. He calls for interaction, so that's exactly what I'm going to offer him here. Let me share my screen. And let's start around the 6-minute mark.
So the first part of this, I just want to say publicly, first point, the Sedes and the Beneplenists, aka BIP, should be treated as separated brethren at worst. I think it's rather unfortunate that it seems that there is this. This is what Meaning of Catholic is all about. It's all about bringing people together to debate and discuss things that are disputed. And
now, I would take the position that somebody who's a sedevacantist or a Beneplenist, which I don't even know how you would be at this moment, because Benedict died. So there is no such thing as Benevacantism anymore. We're still talking about it because some people haven't processed that yet. So we still have to address Benevacantism and Beneplenism. But there is really no such thing because Benedict died. We can talk about how this works in relation to when Benedict was still alive and still talk about Beneplenism or Benevacantism in that sense. But as far as right now, you don't have Benevacantists anymore. You just either have Catholics or Sedevacantists. You don't have anything in between. But I would take the position that a Sedevacantist is a separated brother. They presumably have been baptized. As long as they've been baptized, they're separated brethren. Just like a Protestant, we would say a Protestant is a separated brother. Now, Protestants may have more problems than a Sedevacantist and are most likely further removed from the unity of the church than a Sedevacantist. I would think a Sedevacantists is closer to the unity of the church, because they probably are going to accept, the dogmas of the Catholic Church, whereas most Protestants wouldn't accept all of them. And so I would think that Sedevacantists are closer, but I would still say, yeah, they're separated brethren, but they're still in schism, right? They're still in schism. So we can say separated brethren, sure, but they're still in schism. Just like I would say of a Protestant, they're not only at the very least materially in schism, they're also material heretics. Just because they're separated brethren doesn't mean they're not material heretics. They're material heretic. Do they accept papal infallibility? No. Material heresy at the very least. Are they in submission to the Roman pontiff? No. Material schism at the very least. I'm not making judgments on, is this formal schism? Are they culpable? Yeah, I'm not touching on any of that. I'm just saying their state is one that would make them materially schismatic and materially a heretic. In the case of a Sedevacantists, at the very least, materially in schism. So yeah, sure, it's we can speak about them in this way, but let's not forget that fact. Let's call attention to that fact. That would also apply to the Benevacantists when Benedict was alive, because they are not in submission to the Roman pontiff, and that is how schism is defined. They're not in submission to the Roman pontiff. They believe that Benedict is pope and Pope Francis is an anti-pope. Although there are different flavors, I understand. But for those who would say that Benedict was still the pope, Francis wasn't the pope, they were in schism. And unless they accept Pope Francis as the pope today, they're still in schism. I've already noted in a previous show that I'm not necessarily saying they're formally in schism. Maybe not, I don't know. But at the very least, materially, they're in schism. So might we call a Benevacantist back when Benedict was alive a separated brother? Yeah, sure. But they're still in schism, right? That's what's being just completely missed here throughout the video, as we're going to see. Those are your Benevacantists. But let's keep in mind, when we use that euphemism, separated brethren, that still includes material schism in the case of a Benevacantist. Somebody's saying no sound. Let me see here. Let me present the screen. Try it once more. I think the screen off. Is that what it was? I only played a very short clip, so let me play it again. One second. There it is. All right, got it back up. I think I left off around 6 minutes and 30 seconds, somewhere around there. That was probably the last part that y'all heard. And let's share audio. Let's listen to it once more.
That it seems that there is this is what Meaning of Catholic is all about. It's all about bringing people together to debate and discuss things that are disputed, and to emphasize the fact that
is schism being disputed today in the church? Is that a disputed feature now? I'm curious. I didn't know that schism was a disputed factor.
As Catholics, we have certain essentials that bind us together.
Is Catholic unity an essential? I wonder.
And at worst, BIP people are separated brethren at the very worst.
So again, he says BIP people, that is Benevacantists, which I don't even know how you're a Benevacantist now after Benedict died, but maybe if there is a Benevacantist out there, okay, somehow you define yourself as a Benevacantist. I see you as a sedevacantist. It's a distinction without a difference now. But okay, for the believers in Pope Benedict as the Pope whenever he was alive during the reign of Francis, can we call them separated brethren? As Flanders is saying here, he's saying that at the worst they're separated brethren. Yeah, but doesn't that entail material schism? Keep in mind, we're using these euphemisms with Lumen Gentium for Protestants, for instance, separated brethren, and that's fine. No, I don't have a problem with that. I think it's a more of a less derogatory term than schismatic in one sense, but in another sense, I do make it a point to eventually let a Protestant know that, hey, you are in schism and you do maintain heresy and you need to turn away from that. And I call them to Catholic unity, and I call them to the teachings of the church. But I understand, we're using these euphemisms, separated brethren. Okay, that's fine. But just keep in mind, when we say separated brethren, translate that as schismatic and or heretic. At the very least, material schismatic and or material heretic. So yeah, at the worst, sure, you're Benevacantists, they're material schismatics. I agree with that. But I'm not hearing that from Timothy Flanders. I'm hearing the euphemism, at worst, they're separated brethren. But what does that mean, Timothy? What does that mean? It means that they're materially in schism. That's what it means. I think we need to be clear about that.
Now, let's just review some basics from your cat.
Let me scroll to the 11-minute mark here.
To be concerned about being is subordinate in soccer. So the church is a.
Listen to how Timothy, his ecclesiology works, and how he seems to understand communion with Christ's church. I found this insightful because it explained to me why he takes the perspective that he does about Benevacantists and those who are in the SSPX.
Communion. So one of the aspects of this, what I want to emphasize here, is that the church is the mystical body of Christ, which is manifested, practically speaking, in communio in sacris.
In part, and what he means by communio in sacris is going to be sharing in sacred things, is what the Latin term means. It refers to the sacraments, and he's specifically talking about partaking in the Eucharist. That's one element of Catholic ecclesiology. So one aspect of being united to Christ and his church is through the sacrament, especially the sacrament of the altar. But that's, of course, not alone. Now, he doesn't say that that's alone. He does not say that. He recognizes bishops play a role here. Pope plays a role. He recognizes all that. But I want to say that those things are just as essential as what he's stating here. So the problem is a person can partake of Christ in the sacrament and still lack full unity with Christ and his church. We have that with the Eastern Orthodox. They have valid sacraments. They partake of Christ in the table of the Lord at his altar. They partake of Christ. And yet we're going to say they lack Catholic unity. We're going to say they're materially in schism. We're going to say that they don't have the fullness of unity with Christ in his church because of that. So that imperfection there is incredibly important. But if we're going to just limit things to communio and sacris, then the Orthodox are in full communion, which is not the case. Now, he doesn't say that, but listen.
In other words, communion manifests the church.
In part, not fully. In part only. Because otherwise you would have to say Eastern Orthodox are fully in communion. And in this video, he recognizes they're not fully in communion.
Again, we're not Protestants. We don't believe in any sort of invisible church in the sense of that the church is just invisible, because you can go and commune at the Blessed Sacrament at the altar. One faith, one Lord, one baptism.
When we speak of the visibility of the church, yeah, we can talk about the Eucharist as making that visible, maybe on like the local parish level. But the visibility of the church is going to be manifest in especially the hierarchy, which is why we would say that the Eastern Orthodox have that imperfection.
St. Paul says to the Hebrews, we have an altar, which those who serve the Levites are not worthy to eat.
But not everybody who partakes of that altar is in full communion, right? Right. I mean, Oriental Orthodox are not in full communion. Assyrian Church of the East is not in full communion. Some Anglican out there who has valid orders through some ordination from an Orthodox or something like that, in some rare case where an Anglican might, in a very rare case, have valid orders, they're partaking of the Eucharist, but we wouldn't say that they're in full communion.
Or as he says again in another place to the Corinthians, the bread that we break, is it not the communion with the body of Christ?
Yeah, but they don't have full communion if that's all they're doing. If they have an imperfection with Christ's church through that visible institution of the hierarchy. And what I'm not hearing is that aspect. I'm hearing more of a focus on the Eucharist. The kind of ecclesiology that I'm hearing reminds me of certain tones in Eastern Orthodoxy.
Koinonia. The church is the koinonia in the body of Christ. And so if you don't have communion in the altar, you are not in the church.
Yeah, with some exceptions, which he recognizes those exceptions, like baptism of desire and stuff like that. Sure. But having partaken of Christ in the Eucharist and having access to the sacraments, especially Eucharist, still doesn't mean you're fully in Christ's church.
At least in a formal sense. One could be, there are exceptions to that. There are invisible members of the church, baptism of desire, that sort of
Right. That's the part where I said he recognizes baptism of desire, all that. We're fine on that. Sure.
thing. That can happen. Okay. But ordinarily speaking, if you are in communion with the church, you are in the church.
Wait, if you're in communion with the church, you're in the church. I don't see how that makes any sense. But I think what he meant was that since the context was partaking of Christ in the Eucharist, I think what he was trying to say is if you're sharing in his altar, you're in the church. Now, I hope I've misunderstood him, but what I'm failing to hear is an identifiability of the church with the ecclesial authority of the church in the episcopate. And I think it's deliberate. And I think it's deliberate because of his perspective on those who have irregular situations with the episcopate, as he's going to say here in a moment.
Period. That's the end of it.
That's not the end of it. That's a deficient ecclesiology if that's the end of it.
Because number 3 can get messy.
Number 3 is subordination to the hierarchy. He says, period, that's the end of it because number 3 can get messy. That is not Catholic ecclesiology. This is not Catholicism, if I've understood him correctly. And I believe I have because I watched it multiple times. And he's explicitly stating what he believes here. The faith and sharing in the sacraments. Yes, those are very important for Catholic ecclesiology. Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's not a period end of story because communion with a hierarchy can get messy. No. That only goes so far. I mean, we could have some instances where you're going to have a problem with the hierarchy. If, the hierarchy tells you to murder somebody, you're going to say no. But that doesn't mean that you can now deny the hierarchy, which is what the Benevacantists were doing. They're denying Pope Francis, or at least some of the Benevacantists were doing. And that's especially what the Sedevacantists are doing. And that is what is being discussed today. So I'm confused as to why we're even having this discussion, because what is being discussed today that Timothy seems to be upset about is the fact that there are people like myself saying, hey, it's schismatic to deny that Pope Francis is the Pope. Why get upset about that if we have a Catholic ecclesiology? Well, I think we're starting to see why. Take a look.
The whole organization of the subordination to the hierarchy can become messy.
It can. That doesn't mean, however, that we're allowed to just completely reject their authority.
Someone can, if you disobey a hierarchical command, are you not in the church?
What? This is why it reminds me when Father James Martin does this kind of stuff, and I don't think this is intentional on Timothy's part or anybody else who does this, but it honestly reminds me of Father James Martin who does this. They'll set up a scenario that is entirely irrelevant. No, disobedience to hierarchy does not automatically mean you're not a Catholic. But who's having that discussion? Do you know anybody on YouTube saying that? Timothy's upset that people are saying, hey, this is schismatic. Who are the people who are saying that, though? Who are saying that this is schismatic, but then saying, hey, you're in schism if you just disobey the hierarchy. Who is saying that? To my knowledge, nobody is saying that. What is being said is when you refuse to submit to the Roman pontiff, and here submit doesn't just mean obey a command. It goes without saying submission refers to placing yourself under the Roman pontiff. But you can't submit to the Roman pontiff as far as being under the Roman pontiff if you don't believe he's pope, which is why it's schism. This isn't hard. I don't understand why this is an issue.
If you find yourself in an irregular situation, are you not
Irregular situation, another one of those euphemisms. Did Martin Luther find himself in an irregular situation when he was excommunicated? People will say, well, these people haven't been formally excommunicated. That's not what the analogy hinges on. The problem is you can be in schism even without a formal declaration. And is schism just some kind of irregularity? I mean, I suppose we can call it an irregularity, but I fear that we're hiding behind euphemisms and softening the blow here when we should just come out and say, you're playing with schism. Stop it. Don't do that. Just like with separated brethren Protestants, I'll call them separated brethren, but I'll also say, hey, come to Christ Church and stop playing around with heresy. Stop playing around with schism. I'll say all of those things. It might not be the very first thing that I say to them, but it's going to be in that conversation because I can't just hide behind a euphemism the entire time. They need to know the necessity of entering Christ Church. And I think that we've been playing with the Benevacantists and Sedevacantists for too long and not just coming out and say, hey, look, you're playing around with schism. Stop doing that. And that's unfortunate.
not in the church because you're not a part of this hierarchical?
Let's listen to that again.
If you disobey a hierarchical command, are you not in the church?
Again, that's not how schism is defined, and nobody's talking about that. So who is Timothy even talking about right now? I don't know.
If you find yourself in an irregular situation, are you not in the church because you're not a part of this hierarchical subordination?
Again, this is a straw man because I don't know anybody who's actually saying this who is commenting on this situation.
Yes or no? Perhaps not. Communion is the main factor here.
communion, not just with Christ in the Eucharist, not just with the faith, not just his mystical body as he's been defining it, but all of that hinges and is also included with communion with his hierarchy. Because whenever you're separated from the hierarchy, there is a degree to which you're separated from the mystical body. I'm not going to say you're entirely cut off from the mystical body, but there's a degree to which you are cut off from the mystical body. A degree, but not fully. That's still an issue, though. It may or may not be something that leads to one's damnation. That's a different discussion, but it is an issue because you don't want to have imperfections in your unity with Christ's church. That's why I tell people, don't play around with invincible ignorance. Don't play around with the off chance that you could informally be a member of Christ's church. No, enter into Christ's church. Come into the Catholic Church. Don't play around with that because it's important.
We don't say that the Eastern Orthodox are part of the church because they're not in communion with us.
Now connect the dots and apply that to the Benevacantists and the Sedevacantists. Connect the dots. It's the exact same thing. I would say the Eastern Orthodox are further moved away from the Benevacantists and Sedevacantists. I think if we're talking about like grades here, the Benevacantists were the closest to us. Now that Benedict has passed, there are no Benevacantists. There's just Catholics and Sedevacantists. I would say Sedevacantists are right there. They're just shy in many ways. That depends on who we're talking about, I guess. But our ideal Sedevacantists, I guess, is just shy of Catholic unity. And then lower in the spectrum would be Eastern Orthodox. And the reason why I would place them lower than the Sedevacantists in the spectrum of Catholic unity is the Sedevacantists will accept papal infallibility and papal supremacy in theory, whereas usually the Eastern Orthodox is going to reject those. So you have an added problem of material heresy on part of the Eastern Orthodox, and there also may be a denial of the filioque, which is also dogmatic, or the Immaculate Conception, also dogmatic, or original sin, also dogmatic. So there, just depending on what Eastern Orthodox we're talking about, there could be some additional layers of separation from us. But the point here is, but the Benevacantists and Sedevacantists are still materially, at the very least, in schism and do not enjoy full Catholic unity. This talk about the mystical body of Christ, he's right to say we don't believe that this is invisible, but then he locates it in the Eucharist. Wait, that's not how we're locating the visibility of the church ultimately. We're locating the visibility of the church primarily in the hierarchy. Yes, we can also speak about the Eucharist factoring into that, but not beyond a local level. Otherwise, everyone who partakes in a valid or a valid altar, maybe it's illicit, but a valid altar would be fully in communion. And that's not the case. There are other layers of communion above the local level. That is Catholic unity. Of course, that's going to be defined as the bishop being in communion with the Bishop of Rome.
That's the key factor. The church is a communion. And that is why if one finds oneself in some sort of difficult situation,
more of these euphemisms, a difficult situation, such as disobedience to a hierarchy for lawful commands, such as illicit ordinations, such as rejection of the profession of faith, such as material schism. I don't know. I'd like for us to get a little bit more specific than just difficulties.
In terms of the hierarchy, that does not make one not Catholic.
It could. It could. Listen to that again.
That is why if one finds oneself in some sort of difficult situation in terms of the hierarchy, that does not make one not Catholic.
You'll notice he does not once pull up the definition of schism in the Code of Canon Law. Why is that? Why is it? It's curious. That definition completely works against what he's saying. Listen to it once more.
We don't say that the Eastern Orthodox are part of the church because they're not in communion with us. That's the key factor. The church is a communion. And that is why if one finds oneself in some sort of difficult situation in terms of the hierarchy, that does not make one not Catholic.
It could, though. And in the context of this discussion, it very well does. In the context of the discussion of Benevacantists and Sedevacantists, yes, it does. That's the discussion. In the context of SSPX, it's a little bit more complicated there. For those who formally adhere to it, yes, that is schismatic according to the church. That's not according to me, that's according to the church. For those who are not formally adhering to it, yeah, it's not necessarily schismatic. You know, attending a SSPX liturgy or something like that. That's not necessarily schismatic. No. It depends on whether or not one is formally adhering to it. So you'll notice we're not quoting the Code of Canon Law and how it defines schism, and I find that conspicuous because it works against what Tim is saying here.
You're not Catholic.
If you're in schism, there is an imperfection in your Catholicity. Just so you know.
If you are that's because this is the third priority. Obviously, it's a priority. I'm not saying we should go around and disobey people and just cause chaos.
And that is well appreciated, but that is incredibly irrelevant to the bigger problem here, and that is how we're defining Catholicity, Catholic unity versus schism.
But the thing is that all of these things are subordinated to the faith, to communion. All of those things are means to that end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Has Pope Francis required us to abandon the faith or deviate from the faith? Has Pope Francis somehow separated us from communicatio and sacris? Please don't tell me, oh, he stole the Latin Mass from us. Please don't say that. You have access to the sacraments. Please don't say he took away the Eucharist from you. No, he didn't. You still have it. You just have it in a different form and in a form that you don't prefer. But you still have access to the sacraments. So you still got number one over here, the faith. You still got number two. So what would allow us for some kind of deviation from the hierarchy? What would allow a Benevacantist a deviation from the hierarchy, or Sedevacantists, or even the SSPX? What would allow them? We're all in agreement. If they tell you to do something sinful, you do not have to obey. We're all in agreement there. The hierarchy is not asking us to do something sinful. So the SSPX has no justification. Benevacantists have no justification. Sedevacantists have no justification.
And that's why the subordination to the hierarchy can be set aside if it is for the sake of the faith.
That just pains me to hear Tim say that. Tim, my friend, you came from, like myself. We both left Eastern Orthodoxy. I think we were also both Protestants. I think you were Protestant too. We both left Protestantism and Orthodoxy for the Catholic Church. It pains me to hear you say that.
Why the subordination to the hierarchy can be set aside if it is for the sake of the faith.
No, that is schismatic. It cannot. And that's why you're not seeing any quotes from Tim on the definition of schism. Why not open out that quote from the Catechism or from the Code of Canon Law and show me how that definition of schism works with what we just heard of a setting aside of the hierarchy if it's necessary to preserve one or two? No. And that's not even applicable to today's situation anyway. You don't get to just set aside the hierarchy because you think the faith is in danger or some participation in the sacraments that you've judged you believe is in danger. You don't get to just set aside the hierarchy. This is why I've noticed, I've kind of noticed this issue with Timothy for a while. This is why he defended illicit ordinations, Alcuin Reed's illicit ordination. This is why, because he thinks that you can set aside obedience to the hierarchy for the sake of these other things. No. This is the problem of schism. And I'm not going to stop saying it. We need to learn Catholic ecclesiology better.
As St. Thomas says in the
St. Thomas does not agree with that.
famous passage where Paul rebuked St. Peter.
And that does not at all say that we get to set aside the hierarchy, do what the SSPX is doing, do what the Benevacantists are doing, do what the SSPX are doing. That is a twisting of what St. Thomas said. St. Thomas rebuked Peter, and there are instances where a subordinate can rebuke a higher authority. There are also instances where a subordinate can not obey the higher authority. That is whenever an even higher authority is already demanding their obedience. So if your bishop tells you rape somebody, you can't do that. No. They tell you murder somebody. No. They tell you steal this. No. They tell you blaspheme. No, you can't do that because you're already subject to a higher law, divine law. But there's no divine law operative that allows the SSPX to do what it's doing. There's no divine law operative that allows the Benevacantists to do what they're doing and say what they're saying. There's no divine law that allows the SSPX to do what they're do what they're doing or say what they say, even though they claim that there is. There isn't. So it's unfortunate St. Thomas is being used this way.
So what does that have to do with sedes and Benevacantists? I mean,
No, absolutely nothing.
I'm not going to discuss much of the sedes, but the point is that there is this sort of sense after Benedict died where people say, well, if you have good faith doubts, if you have any doubt whatsoever about Pope Francis's papacy, and you're honestly doubting that, and you think maybe Benedict is Pope, maybe he just died and the Pope died, and now there's, they need to elect a new Pope. I'm having an honest doubt. I have a good faith doubt about that. Well, guess what? There was a thing called the Western Great Schism.
Oh boy, here we go. Didn't I make a video just a few days ago saying stop using this bad argument? Goodness. You'll recall, as I pointed out already, somebody who is material in schism, the question of being in good faith doesn't mean that they're not still materially in schism. It just means that they're not formally in schism. That's all it means. It just means they're not formally. Good faith gets you off the hook from being a formal schismatic. It does not get you off the hook from being materially in schism. And material schism is very dangerous. So you don't want that. But here we go with the Western Schism. Once again, this is being brought to justify a deficient ecclesiology.
Where literally half of Christendom believed in an anti-pope. Did the church stop working?
That was never the claim. I don't know anybody who's making that claim.
At that time? No, it didn't. Because number 3 can get messy.
And as I showed, and good old Saliveri here, he acknowledges the people who maintained those anti-popes were materially in schism. They were materially in schism. You got Saliveri who backs me up on that, and he's not the only one. And frankly, you don't need a manualist to tell you that. You just need to add 1 + 1. It's not hard. You don't need a manualist to tell you that. Add 1 + 1. 1, the definition of schism. 2, a person who is, not meeting that definition, right? That equals 2. You don't need a manualist to tell you that. You just need to add 1 + 1. Look at the definition of schism. Look at the situation. It's very, very abundantly clear. At the very least, those who held to the anti-pope during the Western Schism were materially in schism. And explained how, yes, we even have canonized saints who are material schismatics in this situation, just like we have saints who were material heretics. We have several of them. Aquinas rejected the Immaculate Conception. And if you don't like that example, Gregory of Nyssa is another one for you with his apokatastasis. And there's others if you don't like that one. So Saliveri backs me up on this issue that a person is in material schism if they are not submitting to the Roman pontiff. Here, submission to the Roman pontiff doesn't mean obey an order. That is not what the Code of Canon Law is talking about when it says submission. It's talking about being in union. And that's clearly something that a sedevacantist does not have. That's also clearly something that a Benevacantist would not have had. That's also clearly something that would have been flawed on part of somebody who in good faith maintained an anti-pope during the Western Schism. They were off the hook formally from schism because they were operating in good faith, and there were good reasons for believing why the anti-pope had a claim, but they were still materially in schism. And by the way, there is nothing comparable with the Western Schism and the situation with Benedict and Pope Francis. And now that Benedict has passed, there's even less to compare with the Western Schism. There are no good claimants. This is why I already did a video the other day going over this in detail. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing an engagement with that.
That doesn't mean you're not Catholic.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. There could certainly be a lack of Catholicity with the element of schism. Yes, absolutely. Now, I did mention the debate in the show that I did a couple days ago. Somebody who is a material schismatic but not a formal schismatic. If you're a formal schismatic, you're certainly not a Catholic. If you're a material public schismatic, are you a Catholic? There's a debate here. Some of the theologians are going to say yes. Some are going to say no. I refer you to the video I did 2 days ago for a more in-depth discussion on that, though.
Doesn't mean you're not in the church. In fact,
it very well could mean you're not in the church. That's one of the problems with schism. It seems that, like, we just don't realize the dangers of schism anymore. It blows me away. The liberals, they struggle with heresy. The traditionalists, they struggle with schism. The liberals, they don't see a problem with heresy. The traditionalists evidently don't see a problem with schism. Your relationship with Christ, your relationship with the church can be severely impacted by the question of schism, especially if it becomes formal.
Two sides of Christendom actually excommunicated each other. So they were actually not even in communion with each other. But in
no, Saliveri is actually going to disagree with you on that, Tim. I think you need to read him. He's going to say that there was no actual real division in Christendom on that point. So he's going to dispute you on that one.
Reality, they were sort of hindsight. We say that they were in communion because eventually this was worked out. But I don't.
That is not the reason that Saliveri gives.
Like, I don't agree with Benevacantism. Obviously, I've discussed this with Edmund Mazza, my friend, on Meaning of Catholic. You can go look that up. Is Benedict the Pope? We had a long discussion about it. But the beginning of that discussion, I tried to explain why is this different than Sedevacantism, at least in my mind, according to Mazza's hypothesis, which is slightly different than other BIP people, as I understand it. The issue is that, why don't we apply Vatican II consistently for the SSPX, the Sedes, and the BIP? In other words,
we can. We can. Separated brethren, absolutely. Separated brethren still means at the very least material schismatic. And it could also mean material heretic. And it could also mean formal schismatic and formal heretic. It could include all that, but nothing less than at least material schismatic. Otherwise, we don't call them separated. If they're not materially in schism or formally in schism, one of the two, we're not going to call them separated brethren. They're just brethren in full unity. But why isn't that being said? If you drop the S word, schism, traditionalists go nuts. As soon as you say, hey, this is schismatic, it seems like they go nuts. And they want to dance around and skirt around and use a million euphemisms instead of using the S word. It's schismatic.
Should we not have charity?
Absolutely. Telling a person that this is schism is an act of charity. I wonder, should we approach Protestants and, when we talk to Protestants, just never tell them that they need to enter into Catholic communion? Never tell them that they need to accept maybe the Immaculate Conception or something. Just never tell them. Just completely leave them where they're at. I'm sure Timothy would say, no, we don't do that. Right. We need to, in love, tell them the truth. Sure. Isn't that what we're doing here? In love, we're telling people, hey, this is playing with fire. This is schism. Turn away from that. How is that not an act of charity? It's an act of charity when we do it with Protestants, but for some reason, when we do it with these other schismatics, it's not an act of charity. I don't understand that.
Towards these fellow Catholics or like adjacent separated brethren Catholics who are very close to us. If they could be said to be outside the church, they're the closest to the church of any non-Catholics, if they are not Catholic.
If they are, why is there still a question of if? That's what's disturbing me here, is why is there a question? Unless the distinction revolves on he believes that material schismatics still enjoy full communion with the church. I know an argument can be made for that. But a strong argument can also be made against it.
And I'm not saying they are not Catholic, especially not the SSPX. And I would...
Those who formally adhere to the SSPX, the church teaches they're in schism. And if they're formally adhering to the SSPX, they're formal schismatics. I know he doesn't want to hear that because that labels some of his friends as schismatics, some of his colleagues as schismatics. And I don't want to speculate, but maybe that's the difficulty here. I don't know. But that does label some of his colleagues.
Certainly say the same for the BIP. As I said with my friend Edmund Maza,
same thing for Benevacantism. Same thing. If you are not in union with the Pope, you're united under a different person who didn't even claim to be Pope, you're not in full communion. That doesn't touch on whether or not it's formal versus material, but there's still a lack of communion there.
He remains in communion with Pope Francis. He goes to his local parish that commemorates Pope Francis. So he's
going to a parish that commemorates Pope Francis doesn't make you in full communion. A formal schismatic could actually attend regularly a parish that commemorates the Pope, and they're still formally a schismatic. I'm not saying that Maz is formal schismatic. I'm just telling you in general, just going to a parish that commemorates Pope Francis in the liturgy does not make you a full Catholic. Protestants can attend a liturgy in communion with Pope Francis. It doesn't make them Catholic. Moreover, is it not the case? You could be even a parishioner of a parish that commemorates Pope Francis as the Pope while you yourself hold schism and harbor schism in your heart. Is that not possible? Does that not impact your communion with the church? That interior schismatic disposition, does it not? Just simply say, hey, I go to a church that commemorates Pope Francis, even though I don't believe Pope Francis is the Pope, but I go to that church. That doesn't make you in full union with the Catholic Church.
in communion with Pope Francis, even though he publicly expresses his good faith doubts about his pontificate.
If somebody has good faith doubts about the pontificate of Pope Francis, and I'm not speaking of whether or not that's an accurate description of Mazza. That's a whole different discussion. But for just somebody who, in good faith, has doubts about Pope Francis's pontificate, that's not exactly what's being discussed here. Somebody just doubting in good faith, that could or maybe is not schism. It depends on what do you mean by doubt. An obstinate doubt? If it's an obstinate doubt, then yes, it's material schism. It's not formal because it's in good faith, but it is material schism. In the same way that if you obstinately deny a dogma of the faith, you don't have to, obstinately doubt, right? If you obstinately doubt a dogma of the faith, would you not say that that's heresy? Well, the Code of Canon Law defines it as heresy. Might we say that there might be mitigating circumstances? Might we not automatically call it formal heresy? I know there's connotations with obstinacy and formality. I understand that, but might we leave some wiggle room there and at the very least say there's material heresy for obstinately doubting a dogma? Yeah, at the very least. So same applies to schism. But that isn't really what's being done today now, is it? People aren't just doubting Pope Francis's pontificate, are they? There's a whole bunch of people who are completely saying, yeah, I don't recognize Pope Francis as the Pope. And that's a problem. And that's one of the things that is being addressed. If you cannot accept Pope Francis as the Pope today, there's a problem. There's an element of schism.
That's a totally different situation than a sede who judges of his own authority about all these.
Don't the Benevacantists do that, by the way?
Disputed questions.
Yeah, don't the Benevacantists also do that by their own authority?
And then sets up his own altar and commemorates who knows who.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the Benevacantists were not, to my knowledge, separating rival altars, but that is not the only thing that makes you a schismatic. Just setting up a rival altar, yeah, in Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology, that makes you a schismatic. Sure. And even in Catholicism, it makes you a schismatic, but that might be the principal way that an Eastern Orthodox defines schism, but that is not the only way that a Catholic is going to define schism. We're going to say lack of submission to the Roman pontiff, refuses to submit to the Roman pontiff. The definition for schism in the Code of Canon Law, that factors in with many of the Benevacantists and certainly the Sedevacantists. It also factors in with some of the SSPX, that is, those who formally adhere to it.
Pope Michael or Pope Michael's successor or whatever. Pope Michael, in fact, repented at the end of his days.
Turns out that that's misinformation. So might want to look further into that. Those who were actually surrounding him on his deathbed completely denied that. So that's misinformation,
as was reported. So I just don't like people being treated without charity.
Who's being treated without charity? Pope Francis? Pope Francis is being treated without charity. You mean that? Is that what you're talking about, Tim? Probably not. Some of the things that I've heard the Benevacantists say about Pope Francis have been incredibly uncharitable. Some of the things that I hear from the SSPX have been incredibly uncharitable. Some of the things that I hear from Timothy's colleagues and the things that Timothy publishes is incredibly uncharitable about the hierarchy. Who is being treated without charity here? I don't know.
It is. Here's the bottom line: if you don't have charity, you're not Catholic.
I think we're equivocating, but yeah, sure. Somebody who's lacking the theological virtues certainly has an imperfection in unity with Christ and his church. We're equivocating here, however, with the theological virtue and I think maybe some online behavior, but certainly some things can be related here. But who is being treated in an uncharitable way? Frankly, the one that is being treated uncharitably is Pope Francis, and thanks to some of his colleagues, unfortunately. Why aren't they being called out right now? Evidently, somebody is out there right now calling out schismatics and doing so in a really uncharitable way. Who is that? And why are they being called out? But the big elephant in the room is the colleagues here that one is associating with are incredibly uncharitable. Why aren't they being called out?
That's the biggest thing, because he who loveth not knoweth not God, for God is charity.
Remind that to some of your colleagues, Tim. You know who I'm talking about. Remind that to some of your colleagues.
He who loveth not knoweth not God, period. For God is charity.
Please stand by that with some of your colleagues. Why continue to associate with them when you see that they're violating charity, lying, spreading lies, slander, completely uncharitable, multiple acts of it, and entirely unrepentant of it, at least publicly. I mean, they did these sins publicly, and yet they don't repent publicly. So hold them to that same standard.
And I just don't like the way that people are being treated, because people are, people have honest doubts that we're in a difficult situation. Let's just cut each other some slack.
Who is being mistreated other than faithful Catholics who are trying to say, hey, stop playing around with schism? Who's being mistreated here?
As long as we are really striving to be faithful Catholics, and we're not trying to create an enthusiastic cult, as I think some sedes seem to do.
Martin Luther never intended to create a cult or a schism or anything like that. In fact, he thought he was a Catholic until the day he died. Just because somebody doesn't intend to create an enthusiastic cult does not mean that a person lacks perfection in their unity with the church. It doesn't mean that they're not, at the very least, materially in schism and in danger and need to turn away from it.
Don't want to judge them harshly, but seems to be the case. But who am I to judge? God is their judge.
Yeah, that doesn't really apply here. Because the judge not deal, as we all know, doesn't work whenever it comes from the left, but for some reason we think it works whenever it's coming from the traditionalists on the right. If I were to say, hey, look, it's wrong to engage in acts of same sex. Oh, judge not. Doesn't apply here. God has already judged that as immoral. I'm just telling you what God says. Likewise, judge not these separated brethren. They're not being judged. They should be judged by their hierarchy, who's not doing a great job right now disciplining people, in my opinion, including themselves. But that's a whole nother discussion. But they're not being judged. One is simply saying, hey, schism's wrong. Turn away from schism. Are we not allowed to say that as Catholics anymore? Is that really, is that where we're at?
I'm not convinced by their theories, primarily because they deny the validity of the new sacraments. They believe that, sedes, I'm talking about sedes now.
So wait, he's not on board because they primarily deny the validity of the sacraments. So wait, if they acknowledge the validity of the sacraments, you would kind of put them in the same category, I guess, as the, those who are just kind of, I don't agree with you, but you're not really separated. Well, I guess if we're locating everything in, Catholic unity in the sacraments, then that would make sense. But as we know, that is not the full definition for Catholic unity. The hierarchy is going to be essential here. Otherwise, as already acknowledged by Flanders, the Eastern Orthodox are not in full communion, but, well, they share in the sacrament, so why aren't they? Well, because they lack that, universal unity with the successor of St. Peter.
As I said before, the main issue, as far as I can tell, is not the hypothesis that the Pope can lose his office due to heresy. That's a hypothesis that has been promoted by great saints, Bellarmine,
Yeah, discussing that hypothesis and applying it are two different things. Big difference there. Sure, we can have these discussions. Yeah, Bellarmine, Cajetan, and all these others. John of, St. Thomas. Sure. Yeah, we can have discussions on what happens if a pope is a heretic. Does he automatically lose office? Those are just discussions, though. That's different whenever somebody comes out and says, I don't accept Pope Francis as the Pope. I accept Benedict as the Pope. Or I don't accept Pope Francis as the Pope. There is no Pope. Not naming anyone in particular. I'm just saying there are plenty of people who take that position now. And that is what I've been calling out. And I'm aware of nobody else that's really speaking about this right now. I know Matt Fradd did a brief tweet on it saying the exact same thing that I was saying. I was glad to hear he said the same thing. But I don't know anybody else who's really talking about this. So I don't know who else this applies to.
That's not necessarily the problem. The problem is, one, they take it upon themselves to judge this.
Listen to that.
That has been promoted by great saints, Bellarmine, that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is, one, they take it upon themselves to judge this.
Like Patrick Coffin, right? Mm-hmm. Didn't Patrick Coffin just do that? Yep. And that's why I did a post. That's also why Matt Fradd did a post saying, hey, that's wrong. And if y'all are following this, that's wrong. Turn away from schism.
Because in reality, it's a disputed question. You can't really just take it upon yourself to judge a disputed question. You're not a theologian. You're not the magisterium. Don't judge. It's not your call. It's not your place.
Yep. But there are plenty of people who are making that call. And for some reason, Timothy doesn't seem to be upset with them. He seems to be more upset with people who are saying, hey, that's schismatic.
And two, I think this is the bigger thing to me, is that they deny the validity of the new sacrament. So in other words, the entire church has been deprived of sacramental grace. So how can you believe that the gates of hell have not overcome if the entire reason for the church to exist, which is to confer sacramental grace and save souls, has been destroyed?
Well, I mean, I agree with this part, sure.
According to you.
Mm-hmm.
I find that to be completely ridiculous.
I wholeheartedly agree. We're in agreement here.
And anything I've ever read, I just had Anthony shared with me some objection by some sede where he was just completely misreading Benedict and just reading into him a bunch of heresy that wasn't really there, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And I just find all of their arguments to be rather obtuse, lacking nuance, lacking a fuller study of the tradition. And it's just dangerous, enthusiastic cult. But
very strong words against the Sedevacantists. Very, very strong words against them. But those who formally adhere to schism, I'm not hearing equally strong words. Those who are tearing down others with the word of their mouth, murdering others with their words, those who are spreading lies and slander, I'm not hearing a strong rebuke against them.
We'll still cut them some slack. Hey, I mean, are they trying to be faithful Catholics? Probably most of them. They're probably just trying to do their best here because we're in a situation like this. Okay, so I'm even going to cut the sedes some slack here.
I think that you could have somebody who's Sedevacantist who they're operating in good faith. So it's possible that, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity are present, and they're still united to Christ, though they have imperfection in their unity with the church, and thus their unity with Christ. It's possible, however, that they're still in union with Jesus. I could say that of Protestants too, and Eastern Orthodox.
So let's just try our best to work out our salvation and help each other as best we can here. I think the main thing is that it is not your place to label fellow Catholics on questions which are questiones disputate.
Yeah, more of the judge not lest ye be judged argument here. This again reminds me of the argumentation that I hear from the left. I know it's not like, I know he's not intending that, but it's just, it reminds me, judge not kind of argument. I'm not aware of anybody who is saying it's their place to make labels. I'm aware of the church that makes labels. The church decides what schism is. And I'm just saying, hey, here's what the church says schism is. You guys are denying this. That's schism. That's not me placing labels on anybody. That's just recognizing what the church says. If that's placing labels on people and I can't do that, we can say the same thing about every other sin. But we don't, because we recognize it's legitimate to say, well, the church says this is immoral. If a person commits this action, we say, hey, that act is immoral. I'm not making a judgment on their soul. There could be mitigating circumstances, but I'm making a judgment on their action. And that's not labeling and aggregating some kind of authority to myself to make a label. Now, Timothy's not speaking of me. Well, he doesn't explicitly identify me here. So he might have the out of, well, I'm referring to somebody else. Who are you referring to, though? Who else is calling out the schismatics? Who are they? I haven't heard them. I'd love to know who they are. I'd like to get in touch with them. I'd like to get some help from them. I'd like to see more people calling out the schismatics at this point, because people aren't doing it. So if he's not referring to me, who's he referring to? Matt Fradd, who made one tweet on this the other day? Matt Fradd said exactly what I said, so then it would apply to me as well.
It's not your place. None of us, I'm a layman. I'm not a theologian. It's not my place to label another individual, especially not by name.
Again, we can turn this around really easy. Oddly enough, they don't apply that to Father James Martin. I'm just throwing that one out there. Just saying, they got all kinds of labels for Father James Martin. the I'm just a layman, I'm not a theologian, that goes out the window whenever we're discussing James Martin. Why is that? You know why? Because he's on the other end of the spectrum of them and they feel comfortable criticizing him. But you know what? For people that you're close to, your colleagues, your friends, yeah, it's a little uncomfortable. I get that. But just be consistent in your reasoning for this, because I can just throw that right back in your face and say, well, I guess none of you are ever going to call James Martin a heretic ever again. Ever. I guess none of y'all are ever going to call James Martin a liberal ever again. I guess none of y'all are ever going to label Pope Francis ever again. I guess none of y'all are ever going to label bishops ever again. Sounding familiar, right? Yeah. Because there's plenty of labels that y'all give for Pope Francis, and plenty of them that you give for bishops that you don't like. But somehow, when it comes to friends who meet the description of schism, okay.
Say that you are a X, you are a XYZ, you are a label, you are this label, you are that label. It's not my place. I can't do that. That's the magisterium's job. Magisterium's job is to label.
Just remember that whenever you continue to publish your articles, Timothy. Just remember that. I look forward to seeing you not using labels. I look forward to that.
A particular proposition to be erroneous or heretical or temerarious or whatever. That's their job. Let them do it.
Mm-hmm. Theologians can also do that, by the way. You've had John Joy on this show multiple times. He'll confirm that.
It's not your job. And it's certainly not some YouTuber, or who.
There he goes, some YouTuber, huh? Who are these YouTubers, Tim? Who are you calling out specifically? Let's hear the name, because I think that you're referring to me. But if you're not, who are you talking about? I'd love to talk to these YouTubers who are calling out schism and offering labels here for the Benevacantists and Sedevacantists. I want to team up with these people. I need to do some shows with them. Tell me who they are, Tim. Wow. I think we know that he's referring to me. I think that's morally certain. Obviously, it's possible he's not referring to me. He's referring to somebody else. But you know what? Everything he says would still apply to me, because I do label people. I do say, hey, this is schismatic. Absolutely. And if you hold to schism, you're materially in schism. I have no problem labeling people, because that's exactly what we're called to do as Christians. You label people all the time. You call them non-Catholics. You call them separated brethren. You call them Protestants. You have millions of labels. The Bible labels people all the time and expects us to be able to identify them as such. Liars, slanderers, gossipers. There's nothing wrong with that, right? What would be a problem is to somehow determine somebody's culpability, right? That's when we start to go too far. That's when I say, you know what? I leave that for God or the judgment of the church. But just simply noting that a person is materially a schismatic, labeling them as such, that's not out of bounds for anybody to do, as long as they are just accurate in their identification. And if you look at the Code of Canon Law and you listen to what they're saying, you add 1 + 1, it equals 2. That's not labeling people. It's just adding 1 + 1.
Whoever else, there is an actual procedure that our Lord gave as again, Paleocrat. I've referenced him a few times about the enthusiastic cult. I should give him credit where it's due. He's the one who's really, as a former Sede, he's really brought out this enthusiastic aspect of the Sedevacantism. But I think that there is an enthusiasm on the other side too. There's sort of an enthusiastic cult on the other side of the coin.
Who's part of this enthusiastic cult on the other side of the coin?
Where Catholics want to label each other.
Who are they, Tim? Tell us who you're referring to.
Against charity. It's just not your job to label other Catholics.
Identifying schism now is being called uncharitable. It's no longer our job. It's lacking charity. This kind of gaslighting, it's just not going to work. Sorry. I've heard it enough from the left. It's not going to work when I hear it from the right. We can know what schism is, and we can identify. We're not called to determine a person's eternal fate or culpability. That is going too far. I don't know anybody who's done that. I haven't done that. But we can identify that a person is objectively, at the very least materially, in schism or heresy or something like that. Nothing wrong with that. Listen to what he says here about Matthew 18.
If you really are concerned that your brother in Christ is a heretic or is a schismatic or a dissenter or whatever label, if you're really concerned about that, our Lord gave you a procedure. Go to him privately, talk to him. If he doesn't listen, bring the brethren. And if he doesn't listen to y'all, tell the church.
This is a perfect example of scripture twisting. I see Protestants do it all the time. Sad to see it here with Timothy. I don't think it's intentional on his part, but it is still objectively twisting scripture, because if a person publicly states that they reject Pope Francis, I don't have to go to him privately. That does not apply. If a person spreads error publicly, you can respond to it publicly. You don't have to go to them in private. That is not what Jesus is referring to. He's referring to other situations. If a person spreads falsehood publicly, you don't have to go to him. Timothy, do you go to Pope Francis every time you criticize him? Have you gone and talked to him privately? Have you gone and talked to the bishops anytime you've criticized a bishop or anybody that you've ever criticized? Have you gone and talked to them privately first? No, probably not. In some cases, maybe you have, but I'm sure you haven't done it in every case. The reason why is because you probably recognize yourself public error can be responded to publicly. Now, one might say, well, I don't have access to Pope Francis, or I don't have access to this bishop. Okay, well, let me be strict here. Jesus said, go to him privately first before you take it to the church and before you go beyond that. Well, if you can't go to Pope Francis privately, I guess you can't criticize him. You can't go to the next step. If you haven't crossed the first step, you can't go to the next step. So I guess we'll never hear you criticize Pope Francis, or we'll never hear you criticize a bishop, or we'll never hear you criticize, I don't know, James Martin, because you didn't get in touch with them, because you were unable to get in touch with them. This is an absurd standard in the context of this discussion. Yeah, if your brother sins against you, yes, go to him privately. Absolutely. Sure. This is beyond that. People are in the public forum proclaiming error, leading souls astray from Christ. That can be responded to publicly without any kind of private interaction. And I'll note, has Timothy gone and had a private conversation with whoever he's criticizing here? I'm curious. It seems that he has a problem with the person he's criticizing. Has he gone and spoke to them privately? I'd like to know. I'd like to know who they are so I can go, again, team up with them, because it sounds like they're actually doing a good job by calling out schism.
So then you go to the authority at that point. There's a procedure for that. Don't go denouncing all of your fellow Catholics, labeling them.
Denouncing fellow Catholics. So identifying schism now is denouncing fellow Catholics and labeling them. Got it. Got it. It's exactly what the left tells us whenever we start to say, hey, yeah, killing a baby, that's murder. Oh, no, you can't say that. No. Oh, same-sex acts, yeah, that's called sodomy. Oh, no, you can't label people. Can't label fellow Catholics, I guess. What it is schism is no longer seen as a sin for a lot of people. And it's frankly because, there's a lot of us on this end of the spectrum who are guilty of schism in one way or another, materially or formally, the very least materially. And so it's harder for us to see that as a problem because it's closer to home.
Detracting them. This is not a Catholic.
Listen to that. Detracting. Who's detracting anyone?
Catholics. Labeling them, detracting them. This is not a Catholic attitude.
Detracting them? You mean like your colleague? Oh, wow. I won't name him. You know who he is. Even though I could publicly name him because he does it publicly. I don't have to. You know who I'm talking about. Who's detracting other than the people in your camp? Honest question. Who's engaging in detraction? Detraction is obviously, I think what he means by that is slander. Very technically, it's revealing of a private fault, but I think what he means by that is just slander. Yeah. Who's doing that? I'd love to know, because it's actually your colleagues who fit that bill. Some of the things that they say when they lie and they slander, and again, they destroy people with the words of their mouth. Is that charity? Where's the passion? Where's the rebukes there? You continue to work with them. Why is that? I'm curious. I don't know.
We need to have charity. Charity is above all. Charity Charity is the greatest faith, hope, and charity.
Yeah, truth and charity, right? And by the way, charity doesn't ignore the fact that that requires people to repent of their sins, right? Charity doesn't cause me to overlook unrepentant sins, right? Otherwise, every mortal sinner would enjoy God in the beatific vision. So keep that in mind too. All right, we'll leave it there. I think that that's enough. And I think the big takeaway here is I'm not hearing a Catholic definition of Catholic unity, ultimately, unfortunately. Perhaps he can clarify that for us, but how does the Code of Canon Laws definition of schism work with those who formally adhere to the SSPX, those who reject Pope Francis's pontificate and accept Benedict as Pope, or those who say Pope Francis is not the Pope and there is no Pope? How do they not fit the bill of schism in light of the Code of Canon Law? Now, if we're redefining Catholic unity, as I kind of heard today, then yeah, sure, we can redefine things and use an Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology, and yeah, sure. But it's no longer a Catholic ecclesiology. It's more of an Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology at that point, with a veneer of Catholicism on top of it, but it's still at the heart an Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology. So I'd like to hear how maybe what we heard today can be reconciled with the Code of Canon Law. Perhaps he'll offer us something, and that way we can see how what we heard is still a Catholic ecclesiology and not something else. And what I would like to see is equal passion against others in this same camp who are engaging in grave sin in public forums. I would like to see some passion there as well. I'd like to see those same rebukes that we just heard apply to them. All right. Hope you all enjoyed it. See you later.
Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.